everybody, to this talk, which is part of our speakers series that's hosted by the chair in transgender studies. We're really glad that you could join us. So for those who haven't met me before, my name is Aaron DeVore, and I'm the founder of the chair in transgender studies and the Transgender Archives and the Moving Trans History Forward conferences. So we're coming to you from the University of Victoria, and we'll start with a territorial acknowledgement. So we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Squamish peoples on whose territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. For me, the only further thing I want to say is to introduce our speaker. And so Kai Muir is an Environmental Studies MSc student in the Ocean History Lab at UVic. His master's research is focused on assessing the potential of historical biological surveys and industry periodicals to inform modern management of Pacific herring stocks in the Strait of Georgia. This is his second major research project with the Ocean History Lab. In 2023, he completed an undergraduate geography honors thesis quantifying the catch of Pacific cod in the Gulf of Alaska throughout the rise and fall of the early 20th century salt cod industry. Outside of his historical research, Kai enjoys spending time in the field, volunteering for local marine monitoring initiatives. So the title is Herring Historical Ecology in the Strait of Georgia. And I'm now going to turn it over to Kai.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today, and to Dr. DeVore and the Trans Chair Program for making this opportunity available, and to Jay for all of their hard work organizing this session. So, as Dr. DeVore said, today I'm going to be presenting on my thesis topic, which is Pacific herring historical ecology in the Strait of Georgia. And I'm in the second year of my master's project, and this project is ongoing. So over the past couple of months, some pieces have progressed a bit faster than others, and what I'll be presenting today is a little different in some aspects from the abstract that was originally circulated. So if there's anything that I don't cover here that you were really hoping to learn more about, I'm super happy to talk about that during the questions at the end. I have around 45 minutes of material to cover, and I'll stick around after that to answer questions. So my presentation today has 3 sections. The first of which is the ecocultural context of Pacific herring. I'll be discussing the commercial fishery, including related conservation concerns, as well as that ecocultural background. And then I'm going to move into a discussion of the existing historical research on Pacific herring that frames the research gap, which my thesis aims to address. And finally, I'll cover my original research, which really looks at archival sources and historical trends and comparative analyses that are made possible through the information in those sources. So I'll move into that first section on the ecocultural context of Pacific herring and the commercial fishery, and just start us off with some quick herring facts. So in BC, we have Pacific herring, which are a member of family Clupidae. They're a small, oily fish, and unlike salmon, they're repeat spawners. So they spawn annually after reaching sexual maturity around 3 years of age. It's very rare for herring to die of old age because of predation and fishing pressure, but in extraordinary cases, they can actually reach their teens. So they're perhaps surprisingly long-lived for those unfamiliar with herring. And in the Strait of Georgia, most herring are migratory. So there's just a bit of a delay on my slides. There we go. So in the Strait of Georgia, most herring are migratory, and they spend the summer in the deep waters off of the west coast of Vancouver Island. And then they return to the Strait of Georgia in November through December and spawn in February through early April. And herring are an absolutely critical link in the food web between zooplankton and larger predators. When they're consumed by a predator, they transfer this energy gleaned from zooplankton up the food web, making it available to marine mammals, piscivorous, so fish-eating fishes, and seabirds. And in the Strait of Georgia region, young herring are especially critical prey to Chinook salmon. Recent research by the Pacific Salmon Foundation has shown that 86.7% of a typical summer Chinook salmon diet is actually composed of young herring. So right now, we're in the middle of herring spawning season. Pacific herring are really known and celebrated for their annual spawning events. I was actually just at Hornby Island Hornby Island Herring Fest, which coincides with the Hornby Island spawning period. And at spawning time, females lay their roe on macrophytes, so seaweed and eelgrasses, and the males will congregate in the nearshore environment and release milt that turns the water this really characteristic turquoise color. The dense schools of herring at spawning time will attract droves of predators and even shape migratory behavior for some species like sea lions and surf scoters, which are a diving duck. And much like salmon do for the forest when they spawn, herring spawns actually fertilize the coast by bringing an influx of nutrients to the intertidal environment. Work by Dr. Caroline Fox and collaborators has demonstrated that increased nitrogen 15 is present in seagrasses, seaweeds, and invertebrates after exposure to a herring spawn, showing how ecologically interconnected this natural phenomenon is. In the Strait of Georgia region, herring are not only ecological keystones, but they're also cultural keystone species for indigenous nations in that they form the contextual underpinning of coastal cultures due to their centrality in food systems, in trade, and in governance. So at UVic, we're on territory known in relationship to herring, as Lekwungen translates as place to smoke herring. And this photo from 1868 shows a Lekwungen herring fishing site at what is now known as Esquimalt Harbor, which supported a herring run into the 1970s. In addition to smoked and dried herring, herring roe collected on cedar or hemlock boughs placed in water has been a key food and trade good for millennia. And indigenous practices of herring harvest and stewardship continue to be exercised where possible, but declining access to herring has really jeopardized the continuation of these practices. Two short films released in 2024 by the Kohanemutsum Aquatic Resources Society feature Ray Harris, a Chemainus First Nation member, and Velma Crocker, a Penelakut First Nation member, demonstrating herring harvesting and preserving methods that can no longer be consistently practiced on their territories due to local decreases in herring. Maybe I'll share the link to these videos at the end of the talk because they're beautifully made and just absolutely excellent resources. So here on the South Island, the Wasanich hereditary chiefs have been extremely active in raising awareness of local declines in herring access on their territories and in advocating for a fishing moratorium in the Strait of Georgia. And the federal survey data is aligned with their observations of declining herring in that federal spawn index records show that spawning events around the Saanich Peninsula and Gulf Islands have really become increasingly rare over the past 50 years. If a herring moratorium in the Strait of Georgia were to be implemented, this would result in the closure of nearly all commercial fishing for herring in BC. And this is because over 80% of the fishing quota for herring in the province is within the Strait of Georgia fishing district. And the reason for that allocation is that in the 1960s, BC herring stocks collapsed after intensive overfishing, and biomass recovery has been most successful in the Strait of Georgia. So the federal management position is well that there's been a decrease in herring presence and spawning activity in the southern portion of the strait. The total herring biomass in the Strait of Georgia is great enough to support current fishing pressures sustainably. And managers will also point to the areas open for fishing within the Strait of Georgia and state that those are the central and northern sections, not the southern section where declines have been most acute. And I think it's helpful to understand the scale of the fishery in relation to its historical counterpart. So one way we can do that is to look at catch over time. The data shown here is from governmental catch records that have been consolidated by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. They're often referred to by their acronym DFO. And this time series here goes back to the beginning of the commercial fishery in 1888. So we can see that before 1904, the fishery was quite small, taking at most a couple thousands of tons per year for fish meal, oil, halibut bait, and fresh fish. And then around 1904, it begins to grow rapidly. At that time, salted herring exports to China begin, and demand also grows for canned and pickled herring, particularly during wartime. Post-war, there's this collapse of demand for preserved herring, both like salted, canned, and pickled. So the fishery shifts to a reduction fishery that's really focused on rendering the fish into meal and into bait for other species. And then we see that in 1967, after a period of really intense fishing, the population collapses and there's a 2-year fisheries closure. And what emerges out of that closure is a fishery predominantly focused on sac roe and byproducts resulting from the fish harvested for sac roe. So herring roe is a delicacy which is exported to Asian markets. And unlike the widespread indigenous practice of placing boughs in the water for herring to spawn upon or harvesting kelp upon which the herring have spawned, sac roe is harvested by killing the fish and removing the roe. So that roe is only about 12% of the biomass of a mixed sex catch of herring. The rest of the catch is processed into products like pet food and pellets for farmed salmon. And while this fishery operates on a much smaller scale than the fishery of the 1960s, there are concerns over its sustainability related to changes in predation pressure resulting from recovering marine mammal populations and declines in other forage fish species, changes in climate and increasing climate stress. We're also seeing a declining diversity of spawn events, both in terms of that northern movement and that decrease in spawning events around the southern Vancouver Island region. But we're also seeing that these spawns occur during a shorter window of time, and there isn't as much temporal diversity of spawning as there used to be. Similarly, we're seeing a declining size at age trend that's being observed since the 1980s. So the size of a 3-year-old herring now is smaller than it used to be. And finally, and most critically to my work, there's an often cited concern that the baseline for modeled biomass, which is our estimate of how many herring are in the Strait of Georgia, may be shifted, and therefore management targets for a healthy stock may not be representative of a truly healthy ecosystem. So when I say a shifted baseline, I'm referencing a core concept in historical ecology, which is the phenomenon of progressive forgetting of past ecological states, which shape environmental decision making. So I find this illustration really helpful to describe this point. For example, someone living in the ecosystem of 2019 in this illustration is likely to look to the 1950s as a past state of ecological abundance because it was so much comparatively richer to their present reality, even though a huge amount of environmental degradation occurred before that point. So this pattern, once it's repeated over generations, can obscure the cumulative effect of human impacts in that we forget what has been lost and in doing so prevent efforts towards recovery. In the case of the herring fishery, the data incorporated in the integrated statistical modeling framework used to develop catch quotas and other reference points has all been collected after 1950. And this definitely raises a red flag around the potential of a shifted baseline, given that mean annual catches in the early 1900s were greater than the catches being taken today. And it's this question of a shifted baseline that I've really focused on for my master's research. And that brings me to the next section on existing historical research on the Strait of Georgia herring populations. So I'm far from the first to be interested in this question of shifting baselines for herring in the Strait of Georgia region. And in this section, I'm going to describe some of the research that predates mine and really helps frame the research gap that I'm aiming to address in my thesis. So I entered my literature review with two questions. One was focused on the abundance and geographical distribution of herring in the Strait of Georgia before 1951, so before the information that's presently being used for herring management. And my second question was focused on identifying biological markers, specifically types of data that can provide insight into changes in fishing pressure or population diversity. So I wanted to know if there was pre-1951 information available that allowed for change to be assessed over time. And what I found in the existing literature was that there have been three predominant approaches used by others to hypothesize baselines for Strait of Georgia herring. The first of these was zooarchaeological research, and secondly, modeling based on trophic or food web interactions. And then finally, some geographically restricted historical research that really went in depth into the archive. In terms of my second question on biological markers and data that could be used to assess specific aspects of biological change over time, there's been really interesting work done in other regions, but little has been done for the Strait of Georgia population. So, getting into some of the work that's being done in terms of zooarchaeology, the publication that I've referenced most heavily is a 2014 meta-analysis by Dr. Ian McKechnie et al. Of fish bones at 171 archaeological sites along the Pacific coast. So data from sites in the Strait of Georgia region indicate a very high abundance of herring, and in southern sections of the Strait of Georgia, herring were super abundant, so they constituted 80 to 100% of fish remains at most sites from that region. Furthermore, the presence of herring remains throughout the entirety of archaeological samples from this region really indicates a consistency of indigenous harvest over time. Additionally, the geographic distribution of archaeological sites is greater than the known distribution of present-day herring massing and spawning areas, indicating that there was a greater geographic spread of herring in the past. So the authors conclude that since pre-contact indigenous harvests captured within the zooarchaeological record, there's been a decline in geographical distribution and mean abundance of Pacific herring in this region. Additionally, the variability that we see in herring populations now, which go through fluctuations of high and low biomass, that variability was either not as pronounced as it is now, or it never reached the biomass lows that we see now because it never disrupted indigenous harvest. So the second approach that I want to talk about is the Back to the Future project, which was an effort led by fisheries researchers at UBC to reconstruct the ecosystem of the Strait of Georgia in 1885 by modeling trophic, which essentially can be summarized as food web interactions between 26 functional groups. And a functional group here is essentially a group of species fulfilling similar ecological roles. And because Pacific herring are so unique in their ecological function, they were a group unto themselves in this model. The ecopath model that they used for this project ran on input data from a variety of sources, including interviews with indigenous knowledge holders, catch records, and archival records on various species. They mainly focused on archival records on predator populations, so there wasn't a major in-depth archival review for Pacific herring. Conclusions from their modeling approach suggested that in order to support the predator abundance that would have been present in 1885, herring in the Strait of Georgia would have been 1.75 to 2.2 times more abundant than they were in 1995. And additionally, they estimate that 30% of those herring would have been what we call resident herring, which are populations that stay in the Strait of Georgia year round. And these populations fulfill a very different ecological function than their migratory counterparts. So distinguishing between the two in management is really critical for ecologically informed decision making. And in recent years, ecopath modeling has continued to be used as an approach in historical studies of herring populations. In recent years, a group of researchers from SFU and UBC have been applying this method to a collaborative project with the tsleil Nation in estimating the pre-contact ecology of their traditional territories, with a focus on the Burrard Inlet in particular. In addition to modeling, this group has drawn from a diversity of historical sources, including interviews with knowledge holders, archival documents, and archaeological data. While their focus has not been exclusively on herring, descriptions of herring abundance are numerous throughout this body of work due to its positionality as a cultural keystone. Findings from this research are directly relevant to understanding historical baselines for herring. And specific findings I want to highlight here are that tsleil diets were extremely herring rich, with herring and herring roe contributing a greater caloric portion to these diets than salmon. Additionally, the work from this research group uh, highlights a rapid decline in herring abundance within the Burrard Inlet that occurred 60 years before the present management baseline. So, historical fisheries reports and transcribed interviews show that an abundant herring run existed at Cole Harbor within the Burrard Inlet until 1884. And after that point, a collapse occurred, likely as a result of pollution from a nearby reduction plant, which was processing herring into oil to grease the skid roads of the logging industry. So that photo at the top right shows an example of one of those skid roads over which oxen would be used to haul these huge old growth logs. And as herring are presently extirpated or locally extinct in the Burrard Inlet, the decline of herring biomass since the onset of industrial fishing and the use of herring in this logging industry as oil, as a source of oil for that forestry industry, the decline of herring biomass since then has really been 100%. So I used some of the historical sources cited in one of the 2023 publications from this research group as a jumping off point for my own research. And I was really struck by the rapid change in ecological state that's captured in some of these historical accounts. So, for example, one long-term resident of the Burrard Inlet stated in a 1935 interview that around 1884, there were acres of ducks in Cole Harbor feeding on the herring. The herring were very thick in Cole Harbor waters. Spratt's Oilery caught them, squeezed the oil out, and dumped the refuse back in the inlet. Whether that drove all the herring away or not, no one can tell positively, but they say it did, and anyway they went. And in the conclusion of this publication from 2023, focused on estimating the declines of forage fish that occurred in the Burrard Inlet, the authors described this collapse at Cole Harbor as the start of a westward annihilation of herring on tsleil territory because it extended to a subsequent collapse at Point Grey, which was an adjacent industrial fishing site. So, to summarize how the results of these studies have defined the contours of my research gap, thanks to the zooarchaeological data, we know that herring was super abundant in the southern Strait of Georgia and that indigenous harvests were consistent throughout time. And the estimated high pre-industrial abundance aligns with the estimates of trophic models, which calculate that herring biomass necessary to support historical predator populations was much higher than what's present today. Results from this small geographical study around the Burrard Inlet area, for which there's been in-depth historical research, including archival research, indicate that population collapse in that region occurred 60 years before the present management baseline, and also that it's entirely unaccounted for within the present management framework. And what this information doesn't cover is the question of changes in herring abundance during the early industrial period outside of the Burrard Inlet, or the question about the availability of pre-1951 biological data that could be used to assess changes in fishing pressure and in genetic diversity. So these questions are the focus of my original research. Which brings me to the third part of my talk today. I'm going to talk about getting into the archives and historical trends and comparative analysis. And this image on the right is from a full-page spread about BC's mighty herring harvest in the Vancouver province in 1937. Newspapers at the time did cover herring quite frequently as it was a massive industry, and especially during wartime, it really emerged as a huge, important export industry. So for my research, I focused on two types of source material. The first type was observational accounts of the fishery, and these included a handful of early colonial journals, annual fisheries reports, newspapers. I'm still in the process of reviewing historical newspaper articles as I recently connected with another researcher who has a collection of herring-related newspaper articles. So we're sharing sources and working on that. I also included all of the issues of Pacific Fisherman magazine published before 1951, including those only available in the University of Washington Special Collections. And Pacific Fisherman was a monthly magazine with a target audience of anyone engaged in the fishing industries of the Pacific Coast. Also, as a side note, if anyone's looking at this cover and thinking like, wow, I really hope that someone wrote an article that analyzes in depth the gendered symbology of the Pacific fishermen mermaids on the covers, that article does exist in environmental history, and it's quite a fun read. So the second type of source material that I reviewed was fisheries research. I reviewed 120 biological reports published in or before 1951. This report from 1977, the green one on the left there, lists all of the herring publications from the Nanaimo-based Pacific Biological Station, and it really helped me locate those historical reports. Additionally, I reviewed 17 catch statistics reports. Importantly, these contain information on the number of vessels engaged in the fishery and the time they spent fishing in addition to catch. So I'll explain the significance of that a little bit later. And finally, the more recent data that I'm using as a basis for comparison is from a federal database of herring samples, which contain information from 1946 through 2025. So today I'm going to talk about two of the more interesting, in my opinion, pieces of my research that have emerged so far. First, I'm going to talk about the evidence for nearshore depletion at Nanaimo around 1910. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the fisheries data and how this allows for the extension of length and size at age baselines beyond the period currently being used in a management context. So before I talk about the colonial commercial fishery at Nanaimo, it's important to contextualize this area's significance as a herring harvesting site for the Nanaimo people. Fish remains at archaeological sites at Nanaimo Harbor and Departure Bay are over 95% herring, demonstrating the consistency of high herring abundance throughout the archaeological samples and showing that herring harvest sustained the Nanaimo people for millennia in this region. Additionally, the use of dip nets between Protection and Seychellen Islands, which are outside of Nanaimo Harbor, is recorded in oral history that's shared publicly by Nanaimo knowledge keeper Dave Bodley. And early colonial accounts by Hudson's Bay Company employees at Nanaimo repeatedly reference plentiful herring harvests by the Nanaimo. So at the beginning of the 20th century, news coverage of Nanaimo increasingly references the abundance of herring in that area and highlights the potential for growth of a herring fishing industry in Nanaimo Harbor and Departure Bay. Accounts from the first decade in written sources repeatedly emphasize both massive nearshore abundance and months-long presence of herring schools. So, for example, I'm going to read a couple of quotes that really capture the tone of accounts from that period. This one from 1904 is from Pacific Fishermen, and they stated that the season for herring generally lasts until the end of February from the time it begins in November. Sometimes it begins as early as the beginning of November. All the time it lasts, there appears to be no limit to the mass of fish which swarms the waters of the bay. And another quote from The Week, which was a local publication, described the ease of catch during winter fishing, saying that one thing in favor of the industry here is the ease with which the fish can be taken. The boats do not have to go out of the harbor, for hardly do they leave shore before the nets are put overboard and the boats are filled with the greatest ease. So, to understand how removed this nearshore abundance is from the present, um, in modern times, a small winter herring fishery for bait continues to operate in the Strait of Georgia, but that fishery occurs in deeper waters and mostly at night, and large lights are used to prompt the fish to congregate so that they can more easily be caught. So, if we look towards a timeline of this early 20th century Nanaimo fishery, it grows super rapidly. In 1902, a herring plant's constructed to reduce the fish into fertilizer. The following year, reducing herring into fertilizer becomes illegal because it was viewed as wasteful. I think quite correctly, one could argue. In 1904, we start to see this shift towards uh, exporting herring as a food fish. So, Japanese owned herring salteries begin exporting salt cured fish to China. And because it was quite a racially segregated fishery, at the same time, we see white owned fish packing operations, which begin to grow to meet North American demand for fresh and cured herring. By 1908, this fishery has grown hugely, and catches at Nanaimo are exceeding 20,000 metric tons, which is nearly double the catch quota for the entire Strait of Georgia for this fishing season. So the fishery practices during this time were highly destructive. There are numerous reports that small herring caught by seine nets, which are large encircling nets that use quite a small mesh size, so smaller fish can't escape. The small fish in those catches that were considered too small to be salted, they were just discarded dead into the harbor. So there was a huge amount of waste. Additionally, illegal dynamite fishing was the suspected driver of several incidents of masses of dead fish washing ashore. And by the 1910 season, several sources corroborate that herring are no longer coming into Departure Bay and Nanaimo Harbor in their former numbers. And in 1911, at the end of the 1910 through 1911 fishing season, Pacific Fishermen covers this shift, stating that so poor have been the catches of those engaged in the herring fishery at Nanaimo this season that many fishers will end the year in debt, while others barely made expenses. No year in the history of the herring industry has been so disastrous as that season, which closed March 1st. Less than 10 years later, we see that the presence of herring within the immediate harbors was already viewed as a thing of the past, as captured in this quote from fisheries researcher W.F. Thompson, who states that at present, the herring rarely enter the harbor of Nanaimo. By 1911, fishing vessels are leaving the harbor to cast their nets and meet increasing demand for herring. And since 1951, only two spawning events have occurred within Nanaimo Harbor. So, in light of the changing distribution of herring at Nanaimo and the growth of the industry, the importance of collecting biological data that could inform management decision making became more widely recognized during the early 19 teens. And the first biological report on Pacific herring in BC was authored by W.F. Thompson. He explicitly set out to assess characteristics of herring populations in the more heavily exploited areas to determine if they were demonstrative of overfishing, and one of these characteristics was length. Length matters as a measure of a population's health for a few reasons. Intensive fishing actively reduces the number of older and therefore larger individuals in a population by increasing mortality. And the use of size selective fishing gear, like gill nets, which allow smaller fish to swim through the gear, can really compound decreases in size over time by removing larger fish from the genetic pool. A decrease in mean length over time will affect the reproductive potential of the population, as size is positively correlated with fecundity, and large females have higher roe to body weight ratio than small females. So, thankfully for me, as someone hoping to do a comparative analysis of this historical data, length of Strait of Georgia herring has been measured using the same approach for over 100 years. Most of the reports I consulted from the historical period have been summarized in a chart series. Fish were binned into 5 mm length categories, and then these were plotted as percentages of the sample. And the historical length information available for samples taken prior to 1951 was mostly taken from what the DFO refers to as Area 17 and the northern portion of Area 18. Essentially, this is from the vicinity of Nanoose Bay, extending down to Salt Spring Island. The historical data availability for the historical period isn't annual, it's quite sporadic throughout the period. There's data available for the years 1915 and 1916, and then 1929 through 1935. And I'm comparing this data to the DFO biosample database, which begins in 1946 and continues to present. So one of the most basic visualizations of this data is the mean length series, which I plotted with a line for Pacific Fisheries Management Area 17, so that area in the vicinity of Nanaimo and Nanoose Bay, as that's the region with the most complete data set. Dashed lines indicate sections where annual data is missing. So even without a trend line on this figure, we can see that there was an evident decline in mean length since the 1980s. This isn't a novel finding, as that trend is contained within the biosample data currently being used in management rather than the historical sample, and it's being mentioned in DFO publications. But what the historical data, while limited, does suggest is that the mean lengths we are seeing now are more severely depressed than any that have been recorded in the fisheries past, including from samples taken in areas that were extremely intensely exploited. So, for instance, the samples taken in 1915 and 1916 on this figure, those are not baseline pre-fishery states. Those are taken from Nanaimo at a time when the fishing pressure in that area, just outside the immediate harbors, was extremely localized and intense. But to highlight some shortcomings of analysis based solely on mean length, I want to unpack the historical data a little bit. So this figure presents the mean lengths for every reported sample or grouped set of sample that was reported before 1951. In most cases, several samples of a few hundred fish were taken in a year at different times, and these were all grouped together and reported together in a historical report. But in 1932, there was a study done to compare the variability within samples taken in the same year. And that's represented by these purple dots in 1932 from the Trincomalee Channel area. So as you can see from those samples, there's quite a large variation in the means from each of the different samples, a 2.3 centimeter range in those mean lengths. And an easily identified contributor to this variation is that there were different age compositions in those samples. So that mean length is being influenced by different proportions of fish of different ages and therefore of different sizes. So to understand whether herring are actually reaching maturity at a smaller, sorry, that should be a smaller length, not a smaller age than they used to on the slide. We need to look at length at age rather than just at mean length. So this next step is one that I really, oop, sorry, folks. There we go. This next step is one that I really hoped to have ready for this presentation, but I hit a few roadblocks and my analysis is still in process. So I should have results to share in about a month. But what I'm showing on the slide is the mean length at age of herring in the Nanaimo area from the DFO biosample database and from the 1915 sample, which is the only historical data set to contain both length and age information for every fish sampled. And to fill in sections of the unknown pre-1951 period, so that large expanse of dashed line before the biosample database information picks up, I'm going to need to transform the age composition and length composition from samples taken in 1929 through 1935, which are all reported in chart series like those that I showed you on the previous slides, to estimations of length at age. And to do this, I'm going to be using the parameters of an age at length model derived from the 1915 sample to generate age compositions based on the length data, and then compare the discrepancy between the predicted age compositions and the recorded age compositions to estimate the error rate of that model. Going over the process in more detail would be a little deep in the statistical weeds for this talk, but I'm really open to feedback on this and happy to meet with anyone who wants to talk about it more. I'm also super thankful to Dr. Gerald Singh and Esteban Bada Sanchez, who's a member of Dr. Singh's Strategies for a Changing Ocean research group, as I've been consulting them for their guidance and statistical expertise on how to approach this process. So finally, I'm going to briefly touch on one more data source that will inform the results of my work, which is catch per unit effort analysis, or CPUE. So catch per unit effort refers to catch data that can be standardized by a measure of fishing effort. For example, the catch by one seining vessel in one day of active fishing. And this standardization is useful because it produces a very rough proxy of fish abundance. But without controlling for other variables, trends in catch per unit effort can be plagued by uncertainty. So in the case of my research, I was able to locate 17 annual reports containing very detailed catch per unit effort data, and I've transcribed all of that material. I went to this trouble because detailed catch per unit effort information has a well-demonstrated value in marine historical ecology as an indicator of past abundance, and fisheries managers went to great lengths to collect this information. So what I'm working towards with this information is a general additive model that estimates the impacts of predictor variables, specifically schooling and aggregation behaviors, vessel density, and increases in fishing efficiency. And I'm going to use that modeling approach to estimate how those would drive changes in catch per unit effort and clarify the extent to which changes in catch per unit effort may have been driven by changes in herring abundance. Similarly to my length at age analysis, I'm really open to connecting with anyone who has methodological suggestions about this process. So that brings me to a few final thoughts about this project and about historical ecology more broadly, in terms of its relationship to fisheries research in the Canadian context. So in the context of Canadian fisheries, the historical records that are actually being used in management are often the tip of the iceberg of what is available. Excluded records can include extensive scientific data collection. And often a piecemeal approach is required in historical ecology to make sense of a diversity of data types that span varied timelines and are shaped by changing cultural and economic priorities and shifting scientific methodologies. But it's, I believe, worth doing because these accepted baselines directly affect present-day decision-making in fisheries management and in environmental assessment. And I want to end just on this quote from a 2023 piece done by that research group, which focused on the Burrard Inlet area. And they stated that Coast Salish people are often presented with Canadian environmental assessment reports claiming that the construction and operation of new infrastructure or industry will not impact their traditional resource harvesting practices based on late 20th century baseline ecological conditions and current Indigenous harvesting and land use activities. For example, the absence of local indigenous harvests of species such as herring and ulicun is cited as evidence of no impacts to these harvesting practices, despite contrary historical evidence of their importance. And I believe this quote really highlights the critical nature of understanding the populations that used to be here. Otherwise, consent is created for projects that may totally eliminate any chance of those populations ever recovering. So that is the end of my presentation, and very happy to take questions. There we go. Here's my final slide.
So I want to thank all of you for coming. I especially want to thank Kai for a really interesting talk. It's a little different from what we usually do at the Chair in Transgender Studies, but nonetheless was very interesting and very relevant to our lives. And I want to thank Jay and Zach, who are behind the scenes making all of the arrangements and the technology and everything work well. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Kai, for your research and for sharing it with us.